it immediately made me think of a Christian application. It made me think about Ephesians 4. Speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. So, current soda can opening technology relies on the cooperation of three players: the force, the fulcrum, and the load. It also relies on the two of the players, the fulcrum and the load, trading jobs when the work gets to a certain point. And it made me think about our church, where we all have our own unique jobs that we do to keep the church moving. And while some of us get to keep the same job all the time, sometimes others of us are trading jobs to keep the work moving and when specific circumstances change. So, just looking into what I look at for work weekly in the church, uh, this is kind of a simplified view of my window into service planning each week, since that's the job flow I best understand. So if we take a look at it, it usually starts with the worship planner, Paula in this case, talks to the pastor and says, what do you think you're going to be speaking on this Sunday? Which, knowing him, it could actually change at the last minute. But she gets an idea of where he's thinking at the moment. And then she both sends it off to the grunt visual worship creator, Philip. We'll come back to him. That's what he calls himself. And she sends it off to herself as the worship director. And if there's new songs or maybe something the guitarist hasn't done before, might have to get music, talk about new songs, etc. And then at the same time, Philip starts working on it. And inevitably, there's a question about what is laid out and what needs to be done. Perhaps he'll find a song that he can't find somewhere. So he'll maybe say, well, instead of this, did you actually mean this song? Et cetera, et cetera. So they'll talk about it. And then when he gets done, he shoots it off to me, and I take a look at it and see if everything looks right to me. So I do kind of a first pass on it. Then I send it back to the worship planner. She looks at it. If everything's good, she sends it off to the pastor to set up on the computer. And then, of course, he later adds his sermon notes. Well, let's say Andrea's doing the worship planning this week. Outside of that, pretty much the same flow. Except in this case, instead of her sending it on to the pastor, I'll send it directly to the pastor to put onto the computer. So let's say this week, maybe Crystal's out. So Paula slides into her role as pianist, and that would make it hard for her to be the worship director, so maybe Linda fills in as worship director this week. Outside of that, though, flow pretty much works the same way. So let's say Philip is just too darn busy in school, which happens sometimes. But outside of the final process of me looking it over, since I can't double check my own work too easily, pretty much works the same there. So let's say Lisa's going to be doing a children's sermon this week. So we start off the same, but then Paula will check with Lisa, what are you going to be talking about for the children's sermon? And she might tie that back into the song service. So maybe have an introductory song or a closing song. So it's always nice to kind of know how that's going. And then goes off to the worship director, and we're pretty much back to normal. So let's say, like this week, I'm doing a devotion. Changes it slightly. We start off the same, except she's got to check with me what the devotion topic is. Then she sends it off to Philip, but now Philip has to ask me for the devotion. So I give him the devotion so he can insert it into the song service. And from there, we're back to normal. Well, let's say the pastor's having shoulder surgery or something like that, and Paula's speaking. So in that case, she talks to herself, finds out what she's going to be talking about, sends it off to Philip. But you notice the arrow just got a lot bigger. So with one of these services, usually she's telling Philip, okay, for this slide of my sermon, I want to see this type of picture and I want to see these type of words. And Philip then puts all of that together. Sometimes takes him another couple hours added on to his normal workload. But he's always happy about doing it. But outside of that, pretty much the same, except then I end up doing the computer preparation. Now, everything changes if I'm doing the sermon because I usually end up doing this, putting songs together as well. Uh, so it looks kind of like this. So I start working with myself, putting it together on PowerPoint. I'm thinking about it. I'm putting it on PowerPoint and back and forth. Then I start going through the forced practice audience of Denise and Philip, and I run them through it. And they tell me what they think of it. And then I redesign it, and then I go back to the forced practice audience. So redesign it, and then I send it off to Paula and say, okay, here's what I've got so far. Can you make sure I'm not off base with my sermon? Thoughts? Can you check the songs? Because usually I've got like double what we can have. Just these seem to fit in well with the sermon. Can you find a good flow for these? And she'll take some and say, yeah, check these. We just did these recently. Add this one in, change the order to this, and you should be good. So that gets back to me. I go through it. Then it goes back to her. She'll get it off to the worship team talking about new songs, etc. Then it goes back to the forced practice audience. Then I'll work with it a little more, and then I'll set up all the computers, get it all on the computer, and make sure everything works. The last time I spoke, we had many problems. We ended up finally having to unhook the wired and going to wireless, and for some reason that fixed it all. Still don't know what was going on there, but always fun. So Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So in a large church, they probably have a pool of people for each job. We know the large churches don't just have one pastor, they have multiple pastors, multiple worship leaders, etc., etc. In our church, on the other hand, we sometimes have one person with multiple jobs, more often than not. And that brings us back to the pop can, where we got to sometimes be very flexible in the jobs we do. When we take over one job for somebody that's out, then somebody sometimes has to walk in to fill the position that we were doing before. And I think we do really good at that as a church. So I barely remember these, but this is the old pull tabs. So for those younger than me, that's what they looked like. You'd rip them off like that, and then you'd end up with a pop can that looked like that. Fairly different than what we have today. The only time I ever remember these, I was either Philip's age or slightly younger. We went to Merrimack Caverns, and I remember we got cans of Pepsi, and for some reason they were that pull tab style, and my parents kept saying, how many years have they had these stockpiled? Because we haven't seen these in a long time. And my mom couldn't pull them, so my dad ended up pulling them all, and I was trying to work it like a normal can, but anyway, that's the only reason I actually remember them. But when you're done, you end up with these. And these, as the engineer said, tend to litter the ground. So when one person does the job of three in the church, we had the earlier example, we've got three different jobs going on with these current cans. But with the old cans, you just had the single tasker. So one job going on to open the can, which is all fine and good. And if one person does a job of three in the church, maybe the job gets done and maybe they do the best they can with the best intentions, but the jobs could still have some sharp edges to it. 1 Corinthians 12:12, for even as the body is one and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. So I think we do a good job of it, but let's all remember to keep working in unity as one body.